This is the Jampod Gigsters, a Money for Jam podcast examining the impacts and trends around the gig economy and how it matters to your business today. In recognizing the business opportunity that the gig economy provides for South Africans, we wanted to explore if other countries were encountering similar obstacles in their pursuit of capturing this under-penetrated market. I'm your host, Angela McCann, and today I'm excited to introduce to you an Australian author and researcher, as well as a multi-dimensional practicing gigster, Sue Ellson, who's going to be giving us an inside look into the Australian gig economy. So, Sue, how I want to start out is I actually would love for you to please just give me a brief background into who you are and how come you've kind of built yourself into this whole gig economy world.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, my career started 6 days after my last Year 12 exam in 1982, and I went straight to work at a local bank here in Australia, and I stayed there for 11 years, and I was actually a career recruit, and I started studying part-time, and because I was young, female, and married at 20, I had a real challenge convincing people that I could do a job, because they just made this assumption back then that most women who were married just ran off and had babies. But I eventually left Adelaide in South Australia and moved to Melbourne in Victoria. And the interesting thing was it only took me 6 weeks to get a job, but then I found out I was pregnant. I spoke to the director of a firm and he said, "Don't tell them." And so then what happened was I got sacked. And I was really upset by that. And then, of course, as soon as my daughter was born, I was back in demand. And I thought, this is crazy. I'm a breastfeeding mother at 29 and, I'm not able to get work, pregnant. But as soon as I had the baby and I was breastfeeding still, I was in demand. I thought, this is kind of crazy. And I had this feeling that by the time I hit 40, I might not have any job because I'd be classified as kind of too old. So I made the commitment to continue studying, which I was already doing, and continue learning so that I would always have the skills to, be able to get work and be employable. But the other interesting thing was because my dad worked shift work, I also wanted lifestyle. So I wanted to be around for my children and have time with them. So that was probably my number one factor. And because I'd moved away from my family, I didn't have any babysitters or somebody to look after my children if they were sick. And so I really couldn't have a full-time job. And so from 1994 until now, I basically haven't had a full-time job. I've had a couple of contracts, one that lasted nearly 6 months, but never a full-time job ever since then.
Right.
And so I've just used technology in various ways to stay and work.
Now, you've also written 4 books.
I have.
And your 4th book is around gigsters. And you yourself are a self-proclaimed gigster yourself at heart.
Yes.
Can you give me an idea, like just a visual of what the gig economy and what gigsters look like in Australia?
Okay. A lot of people in Australia think of the gig economy as ride sharing, food delivery, Airbnb, accommodation, that sort of thing. Whereas I think of it slightly differently. I have joined various apps and done various things to see how they work. And I like to battle test things before I recommend them to other people. And that's been a really interesting experience. But also I use my online presence quite significantly. So my first website, which is a social enterprise, newcomersnetwork.com, went online in 2001. And that's designed for people who moved to Melbourne because my transition was difficult. I set up this resource. And so I'm one of the first 80,000 people in the world to join LinkedIn on the 21st of December 2003. And what I quickly realised, because I was looking for online networks, and that was one of them that was around way back then, and I realised that it was a really great platform for people to find me. So I used technology to attract opportunities to me. But the challenge is that a lot of people in Australia are still in that fixed mindset of you must have a job and you must be working full time and anything else is just a waste of time and money and you must be crazy. And if you want to go into business, a lot of the people who have real jobs or normal jobs, they criticize you. And, you know, I found that really frustrating. So my parents are still waiting for me to get a real job. You know, they keep talking about that. And so, of course, it's not going to happen because, you know, I love what I do now. But as a result of this experience, I've had to develop a number of other skills. So I was already really good at managing my money, but that's had to increase. And I've also tried to increase the awareness of gig jobs being a valid form of work. So rather than having a job, you just have multiple gigs, or you have a side hustle, or you have all these other things. And so Australia, in my view, has a long way to come. And what I did with Gigsters, and it's just on the cover, I've broken people up into employees, experts, and entrepreneurs. So I've created sort of personality types. And the reason I've done that is to help people understand where they fit. Even if they're an employee, they can still be a gigster and be, you know, successful in some way. So I guess what I'm trying to do with my writing is help people understand there's a different way to think about work.
Right.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Now, in one of our prior discussions, we were chatting about, like here in South Africa, the gig economy is becoming a rather important resource for a lot of people because our unemployment stats are sky high. In terms of Australia, what is driving the gig economy within Australia?
I would actually say demand, because a lot of people are realizing that's kind of cool to have your food delivered and not have to get in the car and go to the restaurant and put up with noisy kids, you know, screaming at the next table. I think that particularly, like most business in Australia is small business. So a lot of small business can't afford to hire Top Gun, big consulting firm advice, but they can get somebody in for 2 or 3 hours here or 2 or 3 hours there. And then if it kind of works out, they can say, well, I really like working with Mary. I might give Mary a few more jobs. And so it's a really good way to test the waters. And so I think once people start getting a taste of it and realize, well, this could kind of work, I think demand actually drives it. However, there are still a lot of regulatory issues that have not been ironed out. So there are issues for people who end up taking on jobs and not really being paid what they're worth. And some freelancers who would ordinarily be able to charge upwards of 100 Australian dollars per hour are being undercut by somebody on an app who offers it for $20 an hour. Now, obviously, the $20 an hour might not be the same service, but some people sort of fall into the trap of thinking that they can get everything for $20 an hour. And so, yeah, there's a bit of an imbalance there as well. But, you know, I think relatively speaking, it's still a new age and there's lots of wrinkles to be ironed out.
So, I mean, your gig economy so much isn't driven by unemployment or underemployment. It really is people that are looking to earn extra money as side hustles.
Yes, possibly. Also, there's some people who can't get work. So people who are on working holiday visas or student visas, they're restricted as to how much they're able to work. And if they can't, particularly now, get a job in hospitality, then they've got to find other ways to support themselves. So there is definitely some people who have no other choice than to try gig economy or gig apps, for want of a better word. But to live in Australia, it's an expensive country to live in. The cost of living is very high. And last night I was watching a television program where they put rich people out on the streets and make them homeless. And the unemployment allowance is just over $500 a fortnight. And if they have a room in a rooming house, that's $200 a week. So before they pay any bills, get their teeth done, their clothes, their food, whatever, they've already lost, you know, they basically end up with 15 Australian dollars a day to live on. Sure. And that's kind of not enough. Yeah. And a lot of these people, particularly if they end up homeless, also end up with mental health issues, drug addictions, you know, all sorts of other issues. So, yeah. And because the gig economy sort of demands that you be instantly on the phone and click the job now, this kind of thing, a lot of them are just not capable of doing those sorts of tasks. So yeah, it's more of a supplemental thing.
Okay, so talking about these gig platforms,
Mm-hmm.
do you have international gig platforms, or is it local gig platforms, and what kind of gigs are available?
Okay, so yes, we do have international gig platforms in Australia. Obviously, if the international company perceives there's a market for it. The interesting thing is that, let's just take ride sharing as one example. We obviously had Uber come to Australia, and you've probably heard of Uber there as
Yes.
well. But now we have Ola and Didi, and one's Chinese and one's Indian. And then there's a local one called Sheba, which is started up by a woman who felt that some women felt uncomfortable being in a car with a male driver. So it's specifically female driver application. So now what happens is these apps provide incredible incentives to download the app and get your first ride. And quite often it's free or whatever. So the app company pays the driver for that ride. And what it's done is it's drive down the price on all the apps so much, and it also reduces the number of ride opportunities on each app. So quite often a driver will have to be on 3 or 4 apps all at the same time to try and pick up a ride. And then what happens is they might touch their phone whilst they're at the traffic light. Now, that's illegal in Australia. You're not allowed to touch your phone unless your car is pulled over and the engine's turned off. So then that poor driver will be fined over $400, which is probably more than they'll earn for the entire week, just by trying to pick up a job as it's needed. And some of these apps have been super sneaky in suggesting that there's lots of rides in the local area to keep the driver waiting for a ride in a particular suburb. But then what happens is, even though they're waiting for that ride, there's no gigs around, but the app's telling them there are. And so they live in this constant state of hoping that they're going to be paid, but actually not being paid. And so, even though all this technology is being used, in my view, quite sneakily, and it's gamifying the process in such a way that people feel like that they have to be on the road and they have to be out there, but they might not get a gig, maybe one every 2 hours. And the most they're going to make on it is about $20. And, that's obviously not enough to live here. So, yeah, it's kind of a tricky thing. So, yeah, we've got a mix of international and Australian, but I can't remember the name of the app, but there was one app that was really ripping off the gig economy workers. And the government decided to regulate against this app, and the app just left the country. So they realised that they couldn't be compliant with Australian legislation, so they just left. So
do you have like a regulating body, a rating system on which apps are doing better than other apps? Because I know here in South Africa we do have an Australian company. It's called Fairworks. They recently came in. I think they came in last year or the year before to actually start looking at the regulation of how our gig workers are treated. Is there something like that in Australia?
Well, yes. I mean, there's a lot more investigation being done on it. There's some leading individuals around the world who are regularly investigating and holding app companies accountable. And they're also insisting that certain compliance be made. So at the moment, a lot of the people who are performing work are classified as independent contractors. But if most of their income was coming from one, then they're actually considered to be an employee, and therefore they must have casual benefits of superannuation and work cover, which is personal insurance whilst they're on the job, and so on. So interestingly, one of the apps that has been created by an Australian consortium of private investors is called WePloy. And so they've sort of led with that ethical approach of running an app. And so they cover superannuation and work cover, and they make sure they're paid the minimum wage, and they offer them opportunities for training and development. and then they adjust the platform when COVID-19 lockdowns started occurring, and they restricted the number of people who could be on the app so that the we-ployees could still get gigs. They've brought in a new initiative so that unemployed people who've lost their jobs and might have been working in airlines or something like that would be given preference for some assignments over other people. So they've been really proactive, and I really admire ethical leadership in the digital world. And I think that rather than constantly, getting out the stick and beating people, governments and organisations should probably be trying to offer a few more carrots to recognise those ethical providers. But, I also probably think, the world could be utopia, so maybe that won't happen. But I definitely believe that in the interim, we need more regulation and we need more education, because there's an awful lot of people on these apps who think that they earn $20, but by the time they take off their running costs and their parking fines and they're, using their phone in a car, all those fines, they're actually losing money tremendously quickly.
Now, you mentioned just now around the pandemic of COVID-19, which, has hit everybody quite severely, especially, here in South Africa, especially our gig workers, because being in lockdown, they're not able to leave their house. And a lot of our gig work is based in locations. It's, so how have gig workers been impacted by COVID-19, and what are apps other than WePlo? Are apps doing anything to help them?
Okay. Individual apps are obviously going to have their own policy, so I can't comment specifically on those. But what I've been really impressed with here in Australia is the government has stepped in and tried to provide a safety net for as many Australians as possible. So with the gig economy not being the most recognised form of employment, people who are not working or whose income has reduced will either qualify for job seeker, which is if they're still looking for work, or job keeper if they work for a company and then there's been a reduction in the profit of that company. So even as a sole business, which is what I am, I qualify for this assistance, which comes to $1,500 a fortnight. And so because my turnover dropped, I get that payment, and then I can still keep earning money. And because of the way I've set up what I do, yes, my normal income has dropped, but I'm still getting work. But one of the things that's been really interesting is certain sectors have missed out entirely. So in the arts and entertainment and hospitality and accommodation, there's lots of people who don't have enough regular work, even if they were using gig platforms, to qualify for any of these things. And so they've completely missed out. So what individual associations and unions and specialist groups have done is they've banded together and enabled people to register on a website, I lost my gig, so that they're collecting statistical data and information to help this, occur and help people, ride it out.
Yes.
And people have started to become much more creative. So, for instance, a whole lot of people lost their jobs in the airlines. So the airlines worked with the supermarkets and got a lot of those airline staff working in supermarkets to cope with the increased demand on supermarkets, because people weren't going out and buying restaurant food. They had to cook at home. So a lot more staff were needed in supermarkets. But the challenge that we've got, Australia has been tremendously successful in managing COVID-19 by closing our borders. There's only been a bit over 7,000 cases so far and only 102 deaths in the whole of Australia. So because of this lockdown and this protection that the government has kind of mandated, it's meant that people are starting to think about how they can do things differently. So alcohol manufacturers have started making hand sanitizer, and obviously that would require more labour for people to come in and potentially bottle and pack and whatever.
Yes.
The hand sanitizer. So I've seen a lot more people get sort of more gig type jobs now because these new demand areas have come up, and people are starting to think, well, how do I find somebody in these situations? But still, my three main ways that I recommend people get work are through networking, referrals, voluntary work. And a lot of work is secured through referrals. So LinkedIn is really critical, because if you don't have a LinkedIn profile, so when people Google you, that comes up, it can significantly reduce your chances of even getting that referral work. But what I would love to see is these apps providing people with direct access to exactly the type of people they want. So for me, I'm happy to work with people on their LinkedIn profiles, but I don't want to run sales campaigns. So wouldn't it be great if there was somebody who did sales campaigns and I could just, find them on the Gig app and either invoice them through my business or refer them, my client or potential client, onto that person. So I think there's still lots of gaps and plugs that can be filled in.
Well, that for me is one of the most interesting things around what COVID-19 is actually exposing. And a lot of companies have had to kind of rework their models and be incredibly innovative in order to continue with business operations. And especially here in South Africa with our gig platforms, we have obviously Money for Jam, which is the one that I work for, and we've had to pivot our technology. Well, we didn't have to, but we did pivot our technology in order to help our local grocery shops within the townships and our local communities to help feed them, because they're not able to obviously earn money to eat. And a lot of other gig platforms have also done incredible things with, raising money from various companies. But I love that example of the airlines finding work for their staff within the supermarkets. That's an incredibly innovative, kind of concept. It's really interesting. I mean, are there any other trends that are coming out of this that you have noticed?
Yes, there's a huge increase in the number of businesses selling their products and services online. Australia Post is our mail delivery service, and it hasn't been able to cope with demand. So every time a parcel is on its way, you'll get notified that, it's going to take longer due to the increase. And in the past, obviously, the postman would only deliver letters, whereas now they've got to deliver parcels, which means they have to have a larger vehicle to deliver all these parcels. And so a huge number of businesses are shopping online. So the banks are offering small business customers options to move their business online. A local bread shop, they couldn't have customers in, but they decided to convert their kitchen to make meals that they would deliver to the elderly in the local area on a regular basis. And that level of corporate social responsibility has been triggered by COVID-19. And people are thinking about ways, well, you know what, I'm actually doing okay. So what could I do, or I can survive. What can I do to help somebody who is not so well off in this situation? So there's been a lot of collegiality. Overnight, everybody had to use technology to run meetings. And this is a huge boon for me, because I've been doing international work for many years, but a lot of people insist on you having a physical presence at a location that's close to public transport and in a good area and so on and so forth. Whereas now, in the future, I will be able to save an enormous amount of travel time by, running events online instead of face-to-face. And that will hopefully also help the environment. So there's been a lot of discussion about how the environment has been able to take a breather. And one story I heard, I don't know whether it's true, but apparently there's seismic equipment all over the world measuring, the shakes and rattles and earthquakes that are occurring all the time. And apparently, and as I said, I don't know if this is true or not, but since COVID-19, the world has stopped shaking, because there's not all these airlines and there's not all these machines and all these things, constantly reverberating around the world. So I've seen a huge increase in efficiencies. I know of another local printing business, and they weren't printing posters and banners and flyers. but they had a supplier in China who could bring across face masks and sanitizer. And so they shifted their business to providing those products. So, as I said, other businesses would, there's been heaps of innovation. Manufacturing, a lot of manufacturing has left Australia because it hasn't been affordable to stay here. But the small manufacturing plants are reconfiguring themselves so that they can make ventilators. In the case of, needing additional ventilators. And, we've been very fortunate that all of our lockdown and rules have prevented the spread of COVID-19. But, it's been really interesting. There's also been something called the National Cabinet created. And so it means the leaders of the different states around Australia are meeting frequently. And in the past, there was a body called the Council of Australian Governments. And I heard it on the television described as, somewhere where good ideas go to die. And I'm thinking, it's so sad. But apparently, I'm not a party political person, so I don't favour any particular left or right side of politics. And we're on a right side of politics, is the Australian government at the moment. We're under Liberal rule rather than Labor. And so the Australian government brought out Job Seeker, Job Keeper, and apparently this national cabinet of these leaders of all the states is coming together. And in the future, the entire focus of it, it's going to replace COAG, Council of Australian Governments, is going to be jobs. Because the government has realised that the thing that keeps the economy, the health and safety of individuals, the social structures, all of that alive is jobs.
Absolutely.
And I'm so ecstatic to hear that. I'm a member of the Career Development Association of Australia. So our association's been lobbying the government to help people make these career choices. So finally, what I've been talking about in here, in my book, they'll start to realise that people can take, part-time this and a bit of that and something or another else, and in total, if they can manage their money more effectively, they can still have a lifestyle, they can buy cheaper groceries, and there's ways to survive. And so I'm really excited about that. The Australian Human Resources Institute, which advises HR managers, has been very proactive, particularly over this recent Black Lives Matter incident in the US. There was rallies recently here in Australia about all of that. And they've had a really strong mission about saying no to racism. And there was a widely accepted view that lockdown would increase the range of mental health issues and domestic violence issues. Yes. So there's been additional funding and awareness programs for both of those, social concerns as well. So, I'd have to say COVID-19 has been an absolute blessing in many, many respects.
Right. No, 100%. You were speaking about awareness campaigns and just, kind of training the public in terms of various COVID-19 aspects. Have any of the gig platforms adopted that strategy for their gig workers? I mean, have they loaded any information, drawn any awareness to what's going on around the world to their workers?
Absolutely. They've passed on messages that, you have to practice safe hygiene, this is a way to keep yourself safe. There's been lots of those sorts of messages, put out through the platform. So I've been reasonably impressed by that as well. But obviously I'm not across all of them because I'm not using them all the time. But, the anecdotes that I hear from clients and friends about what's been happening online, I'd say it's been positive. The reality is that, 4 months ago, none of us were worried about any of this. And what I find fascinating is that in 4 months, everybody's assumed the world's fallen over. And it has been declared a recession in Australia because we've had 2 months of lower trade or whatever it is that they use to measure. So, we're technically in recession. But some years ago in the global financial crisis, then Australian government, which was a Labor government, basically gave everybody $1,000, and I think most people went out and bought, big screen televisions. It was kind of weird, but what it did is it gave people the confidence to continue.
Right.
And I think that that's always the message that I like to share. What can you do? What options are available? And whether it be money for jam or, just helping your neighbours, anything is worthwhile to give a go. And some of my best experiences, whenever I introduce myself at an event, I talk about how much volunteer work I've done. It's given me amazing opportunities. One example of that is I've been involved in Scouts and as a parent helper. So I spent 2 weeks taking children out sailing on Sydney Harbour. Well, that's kind of a good gig, isn't it? And sure, I wasn't paid, but I was able to introduce, hundreds of children to the joys of sailing and to give them the confidence that they could consider an activity that they would never have had exposure to prior to that event. So I think as individuals, we should all take some personal responsibility and think about what can we do on a daily basis to assist the lives of others. And I know that that's difficult when you're in survival mode, which I've been in for many years, but it's interesting how when you give out to others, somehow the stars align and stuff kind of just comes your way.
Again, you've just said something which is so interesting to me about being in survival mode, and you are a skilled gigster. I mean, you have an incredible array of skills over many years of experience. Here in South Africa, the majority of our gig workers are unskilled. We don't have skilled labor. So are there any gig jobs in Australia for giggers that may be unskilled, or do you even have unskilled giggers?
Yes, absolutely. So quite often if there is a special event, a huge cohort of people will be wearing a special vest and be required to man the handbag checking station or, be directioneers and all this sort of thing. At the moment, local councils are employing casts of, hundreds of people to spray disinfectant on traffic lights and park benches and playground equipment and so on. So, yes, there are. But the people who get these jobs are the people who are on the apps, who are registered with the temporary agencies, who have made efforts to find out what is actually available. And the frustrating thing is it can take hours to go through the process of registering for these online platforms. And many of the time you have to give them your driver's license and your personal identity and bank statements. And, I just feel ill sometimes when I register for these things because I feel like all my identity could be forged and who knows who's got this stuff. So I'm very vigilant at monitoring my bank account, I have to say. But, a lot of people, particularly if they don't have literacy skills, are going to be excluded from these opportunities. And I was part of a submission to the Australian government about a review of Australian citizenship laws. And basically, we were asked if we believe the level of English that you speak should be increased to be able to secure Australian citizenship. And I insisted upon the level of English being increased because you can't speak English in Australia. It's not the national language, but it's just the most used. You are excluded from so many opportunities if you can't read and understand English. And so I feel that if you're choosing to become a citizen of this country, you should make that effort. So again, as hard as it is when you're in survival mode, you need that. Now, one of the things you often hear is this little quote: feed a man a fish and you feed him for one day, and teach him how to fish and you feed him for the rest of his life. Yes, well, that's all well and good, provided that man isn't starving hungry when you try to teach him how to fish. Because he can't fish on an empty stomach, he won't be able to concentrate, he won't be able to pull the line at the right time, it's impossible. So, there has to be a way to find money to feed people and get them out so that their absolute basic needs are met, so that they can then take that next step. Now, I heard from a friend the other day that there's been a significant increase in the number of homeless people in the cities around Australia. And thanks to COVID-19, somebody somewhere has found the money to take all these homeless people off the street and put them in hotel rooms.
Oh, wow. Sure.
And I was shocked. I thought, well, why didn't we give them that before?
Absolutely.
So, I don't know. Can we save the world, Angela? I don't know.
Well, we can try one gig at a time. That's what we can do.
But, you know, there are ways to solve these problems. Does it take a pandemic to do it? Who knows? But
which is a question a lot of people are asking. Why is it taking a pandemic like this to actually bring people together, to actually find solutions?
And to assume that they've got enough for themselves and they're willing to make sure everybody else has enough as well.
Right.
I've always had this social enterprise philosophy, because I don't like welfare, because when it's like a charity, people just take and they don't value that contribution.
Right.
So I'm always on the belief that they've got to make some sort of effort to receive that benefit, and there needs to be some form of exchange. But yeah, what that's going to look like in a post-COVID world, I don't know. But I think people need understanding, acceptance, and a full stomach and a roof over their head before they can consider anything else beyond that.
100%. So in Australia, what do you think the gig economy looks like post the pandemic?
Well, I think that a lot of people are going to start using technology much more, and they're going to start realising that this is kind of a cool thing. Airtasker is here in Australia, and a lot of people say, oh, well, you know, I can get somebody to come over for $40 and clean my windows, which, you know, we don't have home help. Most homes in Australia don't have home help.
Right.
So, you know, I would have to clean my own windows, or on Airtasker, I can get somebody to come over and maybe for 40 or 60 or $80, I can get my windows cleaned. So that's kind of cool, but that person isn't insured, and if something goes wrong, you know, like, I don't really feel comfortable about that. But there's another platform called Service Seeking, and that one is designed for businesses and tradespeople to be registered. So if you want a registered window cleaner to come over and do your windows and know that you're not going to be sued if they fall off the ladder and all this kind of thing. So I'd like to think that more Australian-based apps will be developed that comply with Australian government rules, and that, there'll be more opportunities. And, you know, I've heard of people come to me with different ideas for apps. I think that there will ultimately be more aggregation. So just like there is with accommodation, where you go to one website and you get access to multiple hotels, I think in the future there's going to be apps that give you access to multiple other apps. So Money for Jam, Airtasker, you know, all of those could potentially be on the one app, you know, as a segue to that. So I see that sort of thing potentially happening. I think that families and social structures will start to realise it's okay to have bits of work rather than a full-time job, because, you know, that could be all there is. And so I've heard of one CEO who is now doing that spray disinfecting, and he said, don't tell anybody about it. And then he says, and I'm actually enjoying it.
Wow.
Because he's outdoors, he talks to people.
Yeah.
And he's a free spirit. So, and he was a CEO.
Wow.
So, you know, maybe there'll be more of that, people who've earned a lot of money and who just blew it on various things might be prompted in their isolation to think, well, how could we share our resources, you know, a little bit better?
No, 100%. Sue, is there anything else you'd like to add before we end off?
Oh, that's always a tough question. I'm just trying to think about some of the things I talked about in preparation for this. I'm just going to scan through. There's a few things that I talk about in my book about essential skills that gigsters need to develop. And I'll just see if I've got a specific list. Because I break it up into gigsters under 30, 30 to 50, over 50, different challenges they might have, different support, success measurements. Oh, where did I put it? Some people are just not suited to being a gigster. So, it's kind of okay to realise that.
Yes.
And say, well, look, I'm just much better off doing it. Oh, yeah. It's things like gigster superpowers. That's the chapter, right? You have to have a network. The people who survive in this world are not the one who have the most money or the most security. They're the people who have a network. So building your network is really important. They have to be intuitive and have, a bit of a conscience so that they can sort of follow where things are going, as well as, call out what's wrong. And so if a job's, $5 an hour, well, they shouldn't be doing it, and they should, not accept it. You need to have a fairly strong level of emotional intelligence to cope with the lack of certainty and the lack of consistency, because that takes a little bit of juggling. Here in Australia, we've got a very multicultural workforce, so cultural intelligence is also important. Being authentic, I think it's important to sort of represent yourself exactly as you are rather than pretend, because it doesn't work. Personal responsibility for both yourself and the people you work with, ethics, and being proactive, being wise, and learning from your mistakes. You're allowed to make mistakes, no problem there, but try and be consistent about, learning from them. And you definitely need persistence. I mean, being a gigster or somebody on one of these gig apps, it's not for the faint-hearted, and it's not just turn up and you get paid for what you do. And I remember reading many years ago that the best employees were the ones who were paid by the hour, because, they had to be accountable. And I hired somebody that I found off of a local classified ad, and I was only paying her, I think about $25 an hour, but she was only here for 4 hours. And I sort of thought, for 4 hours with a break, she should be able to maintain her concentration. And I had to put her in another room because I had a client coming to the room I was in. And I found out later in the history on the computer that she'd been checking out Facebook. And I thought, you can't really do that on my time. I'm only a small business, and I've hired you for 4 hours, and I actually need you to work for the 4 hours. So a lot of people who've been used to just having a fairly casual job and doing their online shopping and chatting to their boyfriend or girlfriend on their breaks, or, all these sorts of things, I think a lot of that's going to disappear. And one of the other interesting things that's happened with COVID-19, people are getting a lot more work done in the same number of hours, and it's actually increased productivity quite substantially. So I can see there's going to be all sorts of benefits, but as with everything, there's going to be some challenges as well. And no doubt, as soon as we finish this call, I'll think of some other brilliant thing I should have told you, but
which we can always use on our next podcast.
Yes, of course. But I really think, if there's nothing else, and you say that the unemployment level is at 30%, for goodness sake, give it a go. You're going to learn something, you're going to increase your digital skills, you're going to have an opportunity to meet people. I see gig economy platforms as a fantastic way to build your network, to introduce yourself to new people in a professional manner. And, get your profile completed, fill in all the boxes, make sure your photo is smiling, all of those things. And, be prepared to tell your story. There's a lot of Australians who are very reluctant to sort of splash about, they've done this and they've done that. But in a database, if you don't tell the database what you can do, then you're not going to get those jobs. So even if that is crowd management or security or, any of those sorts of things, if you've got those skills, put them in. You might not think they're worth much. Perhaps you can sew, perhaps you can cook, all of these are skills that somebody, could definitely benefit from.
Absolutely. Sue, thank you so much for your time. This has been so enlightening for me. I mean, from this whole discussion, I mean, one of the major differences that I can find is that here in South Africa, the gig economy is somewhat of a necessity, where it's not so much in Australia. But it's so interesting just to hear the different types of platforms that are functional over there compared to the ones that are functional here. And I definitely see the delivery type gig work exploding, I think, in the near future. It definitely is something we need to look at.
One of the things that's very interesting about Australia is a lot of big companies come here to battle test their products, market ideas, because we've only, 26 odd million in the whole of the country.
Sure.
And, we're the 6th biggest country in the world in terms of land size.
Yes.
So that puts us in quite a unique position to, really work things out. And I'm a 4th generation Australian, but I've worked with, and I've got friends of all different backgrounds, including South African. And yeah, I think that technology has, I explain to people, I'm from South Australia. I'm a Victorian Australian from South Australia. And thanks to my education and technology, I'm a citizen of the world. And I think we all need to acknowledge where we're from and where we are. And we need to use technology more effectively. And we need to be respectful in everything that we do, particularly online, because it can have some really negative consequences. I saw one post about on Facebook today about a woman of colour who was against George Floyd. And I just thought, this is just hateful content. What we always need to be talking about is what's a better way forward. And so if we can all focus on a better way forward all the time, I think that, that's where we should be.
What a lovely way to end today.
Thank you
so much, Sue.
Thanks, Angela.
I think that sums up the gig economy so well. It's all about finding a better way forward. It's clear that necessity is one of the main drivers that is kind of fueling the gig economy within South Africa. But as with other countries, like we discussed with Sue, digital platforms can offer and are offering new opportunities to bridge that current gap between often insecure, informal work to that of formal employment. One of the aspects of gig work is that you can easily switch between different paying jobs, which means the more diverse your offerings are, the more income you are going to make. Another thing that Sue mentioned was that gig workers are starting to put increased pressure on employers to rethink outdated models of compensation and benefits. And it's something that we in South Africa have started to focus quite a lot on, especially with Fair Works coming into South Africa, coming into our country and rating various platforms. Also, with the global gig economy, it's said that it's predicted to generate around $445 billion in gross volume by 2023. So imagine if digital platforms were to introduce these gig type benefits for their gig workers, and how it could really go a long way in helping African governments to power the continent's future growth. I'm Angela McCann, and this is the Jampod Gigsters. We hope that you enjoyed today's episode, and join us next week where we're going to be discussing how digital transformation has become a prerequisite in business sustainability post-COVID-19.